Hey, do you prefer to find the joy in life, or do you just want some help with that? If so, you're in the right place. So come on in and join the Joy Bunny clan. This is the My Slice of Life podcast. Cursed, bad luck, or something else? What happened to the Mary Celeste? Welcome back to the My Slice of Life podcast, and this week we're taking a look at the famous ghost ship herself, the Mary Celeste. Not the Mary Celeste, we have Arthur Conan Doyle to thank for that name. But before we go any further, I need to ask you if you have forgotten anything. No? You sure? So you've definitely hit like, follow, you've checked out the blog, the YouTube channel, and you've absolutely gone to Patreon or the Buy Me a Coffee page, yeah? Good, just checking. Oh, and you've told someone else about the podcast too, yeah? No, I'm not nagging, I'm just making sure. Okay, that's fine. And now we've got all that sorted out, let's dive into this week's mystery. This is the season of the Mystery Files after all. So, Mary Celeste, what actually happened? And I will admit, it's one of those stories that I've heard of, but I didn't know a lot of the facts about it. So let's dive in. On the 5th of December 1872, about 400 miles east of the Azores, the crew of an English cargo ship called the Dei Gratia saw a ship adrift in the sea. Now the captain of that ship was David Morehouse, and he was quite startled when he realised it was the Mary Celeste, because that had left New York City 8 days before him and should have arrived already in Genoa in Italy. The ship's sails were up, but they appeared to be a bit, lopsided and a little bit ripped and torn here and there. And although it looked like the Mary Celeste was heading for the Strait of Gibraltar, she wasn't really keeping a straight course. Now, it looked like trouble to him, so they decided to help. And when the Dei Gratia finally caught up to the other vessel, they were horrified by what they found. The crewmen's belongings were still in their quarters. The ship's only lifeboat was missing. One of its 2 pumps had been disassembled. 3.5 feet of water were sloshing in the lower decks. In fact, Oliver Devoe, who was the Dei Gratia's chief mate and the first sailor to board the Mary Celeste, he described it as, quote, a thoroughly wet mess. The cargo of 1,701 barrels of industrial alcohol was largely intact. There was a 6-month supply of food and water, but the entire crew of the Mary Celeste had vanished, along with the captain, Benjamin Briggs, his wife, and their 2-year-old daughter. Now, the crew of the Dei Gratia were understandably confused and decided the best thing to do would be take the Mary Celeste in, so they agreed to split up and sail the Mary Celeste to Gibraltar. Once there, an inquiry was set up by the British Vice Admiralty Court, and with that, one of the most famous maritime mysteries had begun. So let's go back just a little, right, and get some background. I think that's always helpful to do in stories like this. So the Mary Celeste was built in Spencer's Island, Nova Scotia, and launched on May the 18th, 1861, under British registration with the name Amazon. Not delivering parcels all over the place, however. She was owned by a local consortium of 9 people, with one of the co-owners being Mr. Robert McClellan, who was her first captain. Now, call me superstitious, but bad luck does seem to have plagued this ship. Her maiden voyage was in June 1861, when Amazon sailed to 5 Islands, Nova Scotia, for a cargo of timber to take across the Atlantic to London. However, after supervising the cargo being loaded aboard, Captain McClellan fell ill. Now, he did continue with his job, but his condition worsened, and not long after leaving port, Amazon had to return to Spencer's Island, where Captain McClellan died on June the 19th. So we're not off to a great start. So with a new captain, a Mr. John Nutting Parker, Amazon once again headed to London, but had more misfortune. She collided with fishing equipment in the Narrows off Eastport in Maine, and then after leaving London ran into and sank a brig in the English Channel. Captain Parker, however, wasn't deterred, and he remained in command for 2 years, during which time the Amazon worked mainly in the West Indies trade. Pretty quiet time then. Then in 1863, the captain's hat was passed on to William Thomson, who remained in command until 1867, and it was in October of that year at Cape Breton Island the Amazon was driven ashore in a storm, and she was so badly wrecked that the owners pretty much abandoned her as a wreck. So you can see why I said, look, this is a lot of bad luck for this ship. But strap in, folks, because it gets worse. Okay, so she's crashed, pretty much just put down as a wreck, but she was acquired as a derelict by Alexander McBean, who sold her within a month to a local businessman who also sold her. Eventually, poor old Amazon was in the hands of Richard W. Haynes, who was an American mariner from New York. Now, he paid $1,750 for the wreck, then spent $8,825, give or take a few cents, restoring her. He made himself her captain, and in December 1868, the name was also changed and she was registered with her new name, Mary Celeste. So, will the name change bring about a tide of good luck? Well, not really, no. You see, in the following year, in October, to be precise, of 1869, the ship was seized by Haynes' creditors and sold on yet again, but this time it was to a New York consortium headed by James H. Winchester. Now, there was a lot of change over the next few years within that consortium, but Winchester retained at least a half share throughout all of that. Then in early 1872, this ship, I feel bad for it, underwent a major refit costing $10,000. Now, this is in 1872. That's a large chunk of change. Now, this refit enlarged her considerably. Her length, breadth and depth were all increased, and a second deck was added. The ship's tonnage was also increased. Then, on October the 29th of that year, that's 1872, the consortium was made up of Winchester, who kept his 6 shares. There were 2 minor investors with 1 share apiece, and the remaining 4 shares were now being held by the ship's new captain, Benjamin Spooner Briggs. Yep, the very same man I mentioned right at the beginning. Now, Captain Briggs was a Christian man, came from a seafaring family. He married his cousin, don't laugh, that's what they did then, who was Sarah Elizabeth Cobb in 1862, and together they had 2 children. Arthur was born in 1865 and Sophia Matilda was born in 1870. The Benjamin Briggs, he took Mary Celeste for her first voyage following the expensive refit, and it was to take her to Genoa in Italy at the start of November in 1872, and he'd arranged for his wife and daughter to accompany him. Their son was going to be left at home in the care of his grandmother so he could continue with his studies, so he didn't go with them. And Captain Benjamin Briggs, he was very careful about choosing a crew for his voyage, and while the Mary Celeste prepared to sail, the De Gratia, I mentioned earlier, was actually docked nearby waiting for a cargo of petroleum destined for Genoa via Gibraltar. Captain Briggs and Captain Morehouse shared common interests apparently, and some think it's highly likely that they knew each other, if only casually, while there are others who say, you know what, they were close friends and they even dined together on the evening before the Mary Celeste's departure. I suppose we'll never really know for sure, but the De Gratia left for Gibraltar on November the 15th, generally on the same sort of route, but 8 days after the Mary Celeste. So we do know Mary Celeste left on November the 7th, 1872, sailing with 7 crew, Captain Benjamin Spooner Briggs, his wife Sarah, and the couple's 2-year-old daughter, Sophia. Now, we also know they did have to battle through pretty heavy weather for 2 weeks to reach the Azores, where the ship log's last entry was recorded at 5 a.m. on November 25th. Then, as we know, the ship was found just 10 days later by the crew of the De Gratia. Now, I did mention there was an inquiry, and it was usually just about determining whether the salvagers, in this case the De Gratia crewmen, whether they were entitled to payment from the ship's insurers for salvaging the ship. However, it's a little bit more complicated with this one, because the Attorney General in charge of the inquiry, Frederick Solly Flood, you couldn't make that up, could you, having Flood as a surname? Anyway, he suspected some sort of foul play, so decided to hold a full investigation. But after more than 3 months, however, he couldn't find the crew of the Di Gratia had done anything that they shouldn't have done, and eventually the salvagers did receive a payment. However, it was only 1/6 of the $46,000 which the ship and its cargo had been insured for, and many seem to think this might suggest the authorities they weren't 100% convinced of the Di Gratia crew's innocence, even though, they couldn't find evidence, but they're still thinking there's some foul play here, so they didn't get as big a payment as they probably would have in other circumstances. So, as you can imagine though, after 3 months of investigation, many theories were brought up and put to the test, and one of the first theories was that the ship had been attacked by pirates who then murdered the crew. And there were a few problems with this one though, because piracy wasn't a common threat in that part of the world at the time, and added to the fact that really there was no sign of a struggle on board and the cargo was still there. So, not pirates then. The next theory was the ship's crew had gotten into the cargo, which was alcohol, and then they had murdered Captain Briggs and his family during some sort of drunken rampage before taking the lifeboat and escaping. Now, there are a few problems with this theory too, though. The crew were all experienced sailors with impeccable records. The alcohol in the hold was denatured, so not drinkable, and even after looking for the crew in ports around the world, over time, none of them were ever found. There were other theories, of course. Some people thought it was sea monsters or something equally horrifying. That was pretty much debunked early on. But many thought the crew of Di Gratia were responsible after all, thinking that they'd killed the crew, the captain and his family so they could get the salvage money, even though they had the slower ship and left after Mary Celeste had. So that doesn't really add up. I mean, if the ships were matched in speed and everything, then you could kind of see it. But I mean, they didn't even leave at the same time, and Di Gratia was a slower ship, so that doesn't add up. Other ideas apart from mutiny by the crew of Mary Celeste or murder by the crew of the Di Gratia were insurance fraud and even the fumes from the alcohol making Captain Briggs go mad to the point where he killed everyone before killing himself. So there are a lot of kind of out there theories. But could an earthquake on the seabed have caused sufficient turbulence on the surface? Like to damage part of Mary Celeste's cargo, which in turn would have made it release some dangerous fumes. And then maybe is it possible that Briggs, would have ordered everybody off the ship for fear of an explosion? Is that a possibility? Well, it's similar to another theory which many think is credible, and it does crop up a lot, and it does relate to the ship's cargo. Now, when the investigators unloaded the 1,701 barrels of alcohol from the hold, 9 of them turned out to be empty, and it also turned out that these barrels were made of porous red oak, which might well have allowed alcohol vapours to gradually escape until there was a small explosion below deck, which would have, as you can imagine, freak everybody out thinking the ship was going to sink, so they fled in the one lifeboat. That does sound like a plausible explanation. Apparently nowadays, though, there are a few historians who think it's more likely that the ship hit a waterspout, some sort of a tornado at sea, and that caused the vessel to take on water. And maybe that was enough to cause the panic and make everybody think they were about to sink, so they abandoned ship. However, there is another modern theory. There's loads of theories to this one. So people have thought about this and done a lot of investigation, and like I said, a modern theory now suggests that the pump itself was congested. They're saying like the Mary Celeste had been used previously for transporting coal, which is known for its dust. This is before it was loaded with alcohol, and the pump was found disassembled on deck, so the crew might have been attempting to repair it. Maybe they'd taken on water, but the captain, he couldn't tell how much water was on board, because it was full of barrels of alcohol, and he maybe thought, we're basically about to sink, and the pump just couldn't get rid of the water, so they were trying to get the pump to work. It was clogged with all that dust from the coal from previous trips, and he thought, no, it's not going to work. We're just going to sink everybody off. Is that the most likely scenario? Before you make up your mind, here are a few more pieces of information just for you to get a grasp on this whole mystery here. The day before he reached the Azores, Captain Briggs changed course and headed north of Santa Maria Island, perhaps people thinking now he was seeking some sort of land haven. Again, we won't know, but that's one thing to know about. And after the Gibraltar hearings, Mary Celeste continued in service, but with new ownership. Now, the original consortium sold her at a big loss, and in fact, she kept on losing money no matter who owned her. In February 1879, at the island of St. Helena, medical assistance was called for the new captain, Edgar, I think it's Tuthill, who had fallen ill, but he died on the island, which added more fuel to the fire that the ship was cursed. I mean, after all, he was like the third captain to die prematurely. Then, in 1885, her new captain, Captain Parker, deliberately wrecked her off the coast of Haiti as part of an attempted insurance fraud. He wasn't found guilty in court, however, but his professional reputation then was absolutely ruined, and he died in poverty 3 months later. And here's an interesting side note. One of his co-defendants went mad, and another one killed himself. So I ask you again, could the ship Mary Celeste have had some sort of curse? What do you think? As for Captain Briggs, his family and the entire crew, what do you think really happened to them? I mean, this might be wrong of me, right? But for once, could we just find out, please? Yes, they were all abducted by aliens. Just once. And that rather sick note at the end there, Joy Bunnies, brings us to the end of this week's episode. As always, leave me your thoughts in the comments below, and do not forget to join me next week when I'll be opening another of the mystery files, and trust me, you don't want to miss this one. It's a little different, but when I heard it fairly recently I thought, oh, that's good, I'll need to cover that. But until then, you take care of your wee self.